This video was brought to you by Ground News. On Monday, the UK and EU held a much-anticipated joint summit, with Keir Starmer hosting the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, European Council President Antonio Costa, and the EU's top diplomat Kaja Kallas in London. Despite some 11th-hour negotiations on Sunday evening, on Monday the two sides announced both a new UK-EU security and defence partnership, as well as a number of other side deals, marking the beginning of Starmer's so-called reset with the EU, and paving the way for a deeper UK-EU relationship in the future. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what both sides wanted going into the negotiations, what they got, and what this means for relations going forward. If you're interested in the political alliances and groupings that shape our world, then you might enjoy our poster, Every Alliance Explained. It shows, in slightly confusing detail, all of the world's major alliances and how different countries link together. Check out the poster by clicking the links in the description. So let's start with some context. Going into the negotiations, the UK was basically looking for three things. Firstly, the UK wanted a veterinary agreement to reduce border checks on certain goods going between the UK and the EU. For context, since Brexit, the EU has treated agri-food exports from Great Britain, like raw meat and dairy products, as if they were coming from a third country. This means that the relevant products now need both physical checks to ensure compliance with EU standards and what's known as an export health certificate, which in turn requires a signature from a vet. On top of this, border checks for medium or high-risk products, like live animals, were phased in at the end of April 2024. Now, this is pretty standard practice in international trade between third countries, but because the UK and EU used to do a lot of trade in agri-food before Brexit, these new checks have proved to be pretty disruptive, and negotiating an agreement that would reduce these checks could make things easier for British exporters. Secondly, the UK wanted an agreement on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or MRPQ. In practice, this basically means that people who are qualified in a certain profession in one territory are recognised as such in another. So, for instance, if you're qualified as a professional accountant in the UK, you can do business in the EU as a qualified accountant without having to re-qualify by doing a whole load of exams from a different country. In theory, this would be great for the UK economy, given that the UK's main export is professional services, and the EU is its largest proximate market. In fact, services are actually one of the UK's unsung strengths, with the UK being the second largest services exporter in the world, after just the US. And third, the UK wanted a new so-called security deal. Now, the UK thinks this is a good idea because, well, the UK and EU currently has basically zero formal mechanisms for coordinating security and foreign policy, which seems like somewhat of an issue given the current geopolitical context. Now, the UK had hoped that given its position as one of the two big military players in Europe and the various security threats facing the EU, it could leverage the promise of a load-bearing security deal to force better concessions from the EU on the other issues at hand, or at least to expand the remit of this prospective security deal so that it touched on other areas of cooperation that the UK might be interested in, like, say, energy security or AI. The UK also hoped that a new deal here would give UK arms manufacturers access to the new pool of EU defence spending, which is currently supposed to be spent mostly on European manufacturers. On the other side of things, the EU weren't necessarily against these ideas, but they also wanted two other things in exchange. Firstly, certain EU member states wanted the UK to agree to a so-called youth mobility scheme, whereby the UK would rejoin the Erasmus student exchange scheme, and young Europeans would be allowed to work and study in the UK, and vice versa, for several years. The EU has reportedly linked this scheme to the possibility of Brits using e-passport gates at European countries, or easier movement for British musicians touring in Europe. Secondly, certain EU member states wanted continued access to UK fishing waters, which would otherwise lapse after 2026 under the current terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. According to reports by the Financial Times, EU officials have linked fish to any prospective veterinary agreement, arguing that any veterinary agreement should only last as long as any new fishing deal. And this ended up being somewhat of a real sticking point in negotiations, with talks continuing late into the evening on Sunday. But an agreement was finally reached at about 10:30 p.m, and on Monday morning, Starmer and von der Leyen published their so-called common understanding, setting out what's been agreed so far. Now, reading between the lines here, it looks like 3 things of note were actually agreed. Firstly, the UK agreed to extend the current fishing deal for another 12 years, or until 2038. Secondly, the EU agreed to a new veterinary agreement in principle, which will come as welcome news for British farmers, and was apparently framed as a quid pro quo for the new fishing deal. And third, the two sides agreed to a new UK-EU security and defence partnership. However, disappointingly for anyone who was hoping for a more expansive pact, this seems to be a relatively thin, non-binding framework, with lots of stuff about future discussions basically copied and pasted from the security and defence partnerships that the EU already has with countries like Albania, Moldova, North Macedonia, South Korea, Japan and Norway. The two sides also agreed to continue discussions on a quote, youth experience scheme, but there was nothing concrete. From the UK's perspective, this is sort of unsurprising, given that Starmer is clearly trying to present himself as tough on immigration to stem the tide of voters moving to reform. Similarly, there was nothing concrete on mutual recognition of professional services, although this isn't a total surprise either, given that MRPQs usually take a while to negotiate. It took Canada 9 rounds of negotiations over more than a year to get just a deal specifically for architects. All in all, while a lot of this will depend on how future discussions and negotiations play out, this is pretty underwhelming news for anyone who hoped for a deeper UK-EU relationship. And the fact that familiar stumbling blocks like fishing continue to be an obstacle for deeper strategic cooperation in such geopolitically turbulent times will come as somewhat of a disappointment. But all of this, the deals, the agreements, are a complex and nuanced issue. And as such, there's plenty more to read about it online, with 11 sources already reporting on this story. The issue is though, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't just hugely biased? Well, that's a problem we face when making these videos too, and luckily that's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. For this story in particular, they've identified 2 left-leaning and 4 right-leaning sources reporting on it already. And in addition to this, they've also been able to show the main differences in the headlines between the left and right-leaning outlets, with left-leaning outlets framing the UK-EU post-Brexit agreement as a positive breakthrough, and right-leaning outlets using terms like surrender, ambush and sacrifice to cast the deal as a betrayal of Brexit. We're able to do that because of our sponsor Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. This is all in addition to the bias distribution we mentioned earlier. And together, these fantastic features help you to figure out exactly who's behind the stories you're reading, and what agenda they might have. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think that an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. So if you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan by using the link in the description, or by scanning the QR code on screen. And this offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.